Following is a multimedia presentation that is a supplement to the Sustainable Country Living book. Chapter 32: What to Look For in Country Property. The first thing is the old real estate adage, location, location, location. Now, this picture might tempt you to say, what a beautiful place to live. But if you look carefully, it's probably not a very good place to have a house and a garden and be sustainable and have access to the needed things in your life. It might be a great place to go for a backpacking trip, but it probably is not the ideal country property. Before we go through the details of what different things might be considered when looking for country property, let's look at the reasons for doing country property. First of all, we need to have a sustainable preparedness mindset. We need to be able to, as much as possible, be independent of the systems of the world. Being prepared to aid others, including our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, as well as seekers in times of distress, such as social, economic, and disaster, is important. What you look for in country property might be different than other people. Each person may have a different outlook of what is their ideal wish list of country property. There is a book, Sustainable Preparedness, Reclaiming Noble Independence in an Unstable World, which was written by Craig, Nancy, and Nick Meissner. This is a great resource for considering how to have country property that is sustainable. Besides the Sustainable Country Living book, on which this presentation is designed to be a supplement, this Sustainable Preparedness book is also a good resource. To find how to purchase it, go to preparingforthetimeoftrouble.com and look on the first section of recommended resources. There you will find links for this book as well as many other worthwhile books. So, step one is to prepare your heart. Psalms 91 says, "He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say to the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in Him I will trust." So, if you're a Christian and you're looking for country property in an effort to follow God's recommendation of how to live, then having your heart prepared and depending on God is the first step. The second step is to be open to God's leading. If we pray and ask God to guide us to find the right property at the right time, then He'll do that. The book Ministry of Healing says, "What were the conditions chosen by the Infinite Father for His Son? A secluded home in the Galilean hills, a household sustained by honest, self-respecting labor, a life of simplicity, daily conflict with difficulty and hardship, self-sacrifice, economy, and patient, gladsome service. The hour of study at his mother's side, with the open scroll of Scripture, the quiet dawn of twilight in the green valley, the holy ministries of nature, the study of creation and providence, and the soul's communion with God." These were the conditions and opportunities of the early life of Jesus. We also are told in Selected Messages, Book 2, "Get out of the cities as soon as possible and purchase a little piece of land where you can have a garden, where your children can watch the flowers grow and learn from the lessons of simplicity and purity." So when we follow God's leading, He will show us where to go. And He'll find a place that may be humble, but it will be adequate, and it will be on the land, and you can grow a garden and raise your children in quietness and simplicity. Some other appropriate counsel is the Lord calls for His people to locate away from the cities. Fathers and mothers who possess a piece of land and a comfortable home are kings and queens. The Lord would have his people looking about them and securing humble, inexpensive places, such as centers for their work. And from time to time, larger places will come to their notice, which they will be able to secure at a surprisingly low price. Faith, hope, love, happiness can be far better be gained in retired places where there are fields and hills and trees. Again and again, the Lord has instructed into the country where you can raise your own provisions, for in the future the problem of buying and selling will be a very serious one. Into the rural districts, houses not crowded close together, free from the interference of enemies. When we condense the principles from these various quotes that we've read, we can come away with the following: get away from the cities, but be able to work them. Security, don't be crowded together. Free from enemy interference. A little piece of land. Capacity to grow a garden, so you need space and fertility. Simplicity, cultivated. Comfortable home. Retired places, fields, hills, trees. Humble, inexpensive home. May find good deals. Step 3, we need the basics. We need shelter, water, food, and heat. Step 4, other points to consider. Employment, if you're not retired. What is your current work? Can you do what you do for work and commute? If not, can you telecommute? There may be some other kind of work that's different, but in the same kind of arena that you're used to, that you would qualify for. Or maybe you can do it online. What about previous work experience? Can you be self-employed? Is there a niche business opportunity that might avail itself to you? And what about healthcare? If you're in the healthcare field, you can pretty much get work anywhere you want to live. Step 4 continues. Here's some other points to consider. Is southern exposure to the sun? This is if you're in the northern hemisphere. Obviously, if you're in Australia, it would be the other way around. And if you're at the equator, this may not be exactly the same. So this is an example of orienting your property to be able to take advantage of the sun. So in the northern hemisphere, you want southern exposure to the sun. You need that for solar gain for home heating, such as in this illustration here. And then there's the potential of using the sun for solar power. And then you need it for gardening. So you have 3 different things that having access to the sun is important when you're considering property. That can be the orientation of the property itself. It could have to do with the proximity of trees that might block that access to the sun or other structures. I have heard of people who have purchased property in the summertime and it looks really great and wonderful, not realizing they're on the northern side of a hill. And then when the winter comes and it snows, they're not able to get out because the sun doesn't melt the snow, and it makes life difficult. And it's colder because of the lack of sun. Their gardening season is shorter because of the orientation. So it's really important when you're looking for country property to take into consideration where the sun is in proximity to the property and how you would lay it out with your garden and your house and so forth. Here's an example of some benefits of southern exposure, such as passive heat, like the windows, solar power, like the solar panels you see on the roof, and solar hot water, which are the panel looking units, the 2 in the back. Those are hot water solar panels, and the others are photovoltaic electric solar panels. And the illustration below shows how those water heater panels would circulate in through the house to help heat the hot water. Here's a guide for sunlight hours. Before planting, consider how much sunshine or shade do you have in this particular garden spot. Be observant. Maybe look at that property several times at different times of day. Most vegetables prefer sunny areas that are protected from obstacles that would make shade, such as trees. The sun provides energy for plants to grow. If possible, before you do your garden, record the seasons, sun and shade, as it changes during the year. Fall sun, you need 6 or 8 hours of direct sunlight. Partial sun, 4 to 5 hours of direct sunlight daily, and partial is 2 to 4, and full shade is under 1. So obviously the ideal would be to have full sun for 6 to 8 hours. And if part of that gets in the shade, it gets diminishing returns. Sunlight, most vegetables require 6 to 8 hours of full sun every day. South and west sides are best. North and east sides can be shady. Some lettuces, strawberries, and herbs can do with 5 or 6 hours of sunlight. So think about the objects that are potentially in the way, creating shade from, say, a tree in the summertime. So here's an illustration of different kinds of plants and whether they can tolerate being in the shade or not. Obviously, corn needs lots of sun, and things like lettuce could get by with more shady terrain. Now, the other thing to consider about location of the property is the proximity to open spaces and wilderness. This particular map shows the United States, continental United States mostly, and the green is wilderness areas, particularly in this case, Forest Service, which is owned by the federal government, which means it's not going to be developed. It might get logged, but it's going to be wilderness nonetheless. So if you were looking at a particular location, and the ideal, in my opinion, would be to be backed up to wilderness of some kind. And that way you have protected your intrusion of development of property behind you. Let's say, um, there wouldn't be a housing development that you didn't know was coming or some kind of industry. If it's backed up against wilderness, then probably the worst that's going to happen is you would have a logging operation, and then the trees would grow back. So here's an example in California of a map that you can find maps for wherever you're looking. This is just an example, but this is a close-up showing the national forest in Northern California. And you can see where the highways are, where the towns are. And so when you're looking at property, it's a good idea to go to Google Maps or Google Earth or something like that and zoom back and see what's nearby, so that you can try to find something that's near something that's wilderness. So the question is often asked, how much land do I need? Well, that depends on the land, and it depends on what you're going to do with the land, and how many people are in your family. So, for instance, some considerations is utility. Is there power on the property? Is there water? Is there a well? Is there municipal water? Is there a sewer? Is there a septic? Can you do those? Can you drill a well? Can you do septic? And what about garbage service? Are you going to have to haul the garbage if you're too far out? What about internet? What about cell phone? These things need to be figured out in advance so that you don't have some surprises that might make the property less desirable. I personally think it's important to try to find, ideally, some property that has surface water, either a pond or a creek or whatever like that. Um, when it comes to your domestic water use, typically country property would have a well. That's a nice independent source. Rainwater might be an option depending where you live. Um, rainwater catchment. In my opinion, being dependent on a municipal water system or a community well shared to me is not the perfect solution from a sustainable perspective. It's nice to be as independent as possible. What about schooling? If you're going to have children or have children, where are the options for school? That could be public school, it could be a Christian school, it could be homeschool. You need to think about these things. And what about when you need supplies, building supplies, grocery supplies? How close is it to get to, a grocery store of some size or some place like Home Depot to get building materials? If you're, under an hour away to get to these major kinds of box stores or supplies that you need, that would be ideal. If it's further than that, if it takes a couple of hours to get to a major shopping area for at least groceries and building materials and that kind of thing, that's going to have to be factored in. Maybe instead of every week or two going in and getting groceries and things like that, you might have to plan for once a month trips. And if it's going to be once a month, because of the distance, say it's 2.5 hours to get to, a major grocery store and Home Depot. What are you going to do in the winter if there's snow and it's 2.5 hours normally? These things all need to be considered when looking for land. And the seasons. Um, some people like to be in the arid, sunny weather like Arizona, but then you've got a problem with you've got to have water, and that if you have water, you can grow, but if you don't have water, it's a desert, and it can get really hot. If you are in an area that has a lot of rain, like a rainforest, the ability to grow may be diminished because of cloud cover. Um, you need to consider the temperatures. How long of a season might there be in that location for growing ideally, for gardening? Because in my opinion, the number one reason to move is to be able to grow a garden. Uh, there are different zones for gardening, and you can find these charts, and you want to try to find one that has a zone that fits what you're looking for. Another thing is, what about emergency services? What if there was a wildfire? Is this property so remote that the firefighting apparatus wouldn't be able to keep up with it? The attitude would be kind of let it go, like we've seen in Canada. Or are you in a 911 dispatch zone where you can call and get emergency services like an ambulance and police? These are all things that you want to consider. What about proximity to medical care like a clinic or a hospital or emergency room? The older a person gets, the more important that's going to be. And so country property doesn't necessarily mean remote out in the woods, but if you can have a balance between uh, isolation from, seeing your neighbors and the loud noise of sirens and everything, and yet be, say, within a half an hour drive to get to a major hospital, that would be ideal. And on your property, does it have trees? Does it have timber? Is it got gardening space or is it really steep terrain? You need to figure these things out. What about proximities to neighbors? Um, in my opinion, I think it's ideal to have property where you don't see your neighbors, but they're close enough that you can minister to them and get acquainted and help each other, but not be looking at each other all the time. You want to have some privacy. So keep in mind, there's no perfect place this side of heaven. God will guide you as you lean on him. What is good for you might be different than for someone else. You may move again, so there may be steps in this process. For instance, if this is the first time you're moving out of the city, some suggest that you rent first to get used to the area and to find out exactly what you want and what's in the area. And if you rent for a while and you get acquainted with people in the area, they might say, "Oh, hey, I know somebody that's got this property that's for sale, or they would sell it. It doesn't have a sign. So you might consider renting first if it's your first time to move out of the populated areas. Conditions will change. Your life will change. Your family will change. You're going to get older. You may have kids that you don't have now, and now you've got to consider, what am I going to do for schooling for them? Your job situation could change. All these things are worth considering. So let's backtrack now that we have some overall principles, and let's find out about ideal country property. First of all, where in the world to live? This is a valid question because sometimes people will say, well, I'm going to get out of where I'm at completely and go to another country, and I'm going to, I can live cheap and live my life and all of that. Um, Joel Skousen is an individual who has done a lot of research about everywhere in the world, especially North America, but all over the world. And his advice in this book, Strategic Relocation, I've actually been to 2 of his seminars in person. And he recommends that even though he knows people who have moved out of, say they're from the United States and they've moved to South America or Central America or someplace like that, he says, the problem is if you don't look like the people around you and you don't speak the way they speak, it might be great right now. For instance, you could move as an American citizen and go to Mexico and be what's called an expat, and you could live really inexpensively and everything would be great. The problem is, he says, that what if the political climate changes in that country and the leaders change and now all of a sudden you're vulnerable? Well, guess what? You stick out like a sore thumb because you don't look like them and speak like them, and they might have perceptions about you that might not be to your benefit. So he doesn't recommend moving out of an area that makes you look vulnerable compared to, the country that you're in.
It's very interesting how most people, if you go to any of the traditional expatriate sites, the people who've left the United States and they explore the doctrine of international living. There's a site called internationalliving.com on the website, a website, and they extol all the wonders of living cheap and having access to the beach and all of these wonderful things. And most of the concerns that people have on those websites are, how do I deal with this legal problem? How do I deal with this real estate problem? How do I get American products here? How do I get access to my banking account down here? And all these little mundane things, and nobody's asking the question is, or even thinking that this may change. And yet the one thing that I point out in all of these countries is that stability is not there. Laws change, rules change, the culture change again. There are also long-term economic threats which will face other countries. There's cultural conflict. There's language, there's differences, the fact that you don't look like the rest of people. It's hard to blend in. And you'll notice the black, those of you who can see it, the countries in black are places where there's very, very little freedom economically. And this pretty well correlates to political freedom as well. There's one anomaly here in the middle of Africa. You see the Sudan, and it's white, meaning it's almost anarchical. You can do anything you want economically in Sudan, but it does not qualify as political freedom. But generally speaking, there's a great deal to be learned from this map. You want to pick the lighter areas on the map, which show that there's more freedom. And you'll notice that the U.S. and Canada are not the freest countries in the world in terms of lack of regulation. But those that do, like the Sudan, have almost no regulation, are unstable because of anarchical tendencies.
So in his book, Strategic Relocation, Section 1 helps you decide which country you should live in. And then he focuses in on the United States because most of the people that he's addressing live in the United States. So as an example, he goes into in-depth all of the different regions in the United States and looks at factors that are economy, tolerance of homeschool, finances, the political climate of the, do you have a lot of freedom or do you have a lot of rules and so forth? He also looks at which areas in the country might be a target during a war. And you might think, if you look at the middle top of the map, you might say, well, wow, I could go to North Dakota. It's wide open spaces. Or Montana. Or Colorado. The problem is that's where a lot of nuclear missile silos are. And so they would be targets because of the proximity of these often underground silos of nuclear warheads. So it isn't always what it looks like. You have to do some research, and this book is really worth getting, and it's in my recommended resource section as well on the preparingforthetime-of-trouble.com website. So here's an example of Montana. You see, it's got all this red, which are nuclear targets, whereas Wyoming below it looks pretty wide open, where Yellowstone and all that is. Northern Idaho and so forth. So then he has different regions and state ratings, and you can look in the book. It's very complete and detailed. But here's some location considerations that he suggests to consider: weather, earthquake, terrain, local economy, governmental regulations, foreign relocation. We talked about that. Public and private land use. That's like being backed up to wilderness. Nuclear threats and military target areas. Next two video clips I'm going to show you are two different families that are explaining what they've learned about looking for country property, what to look for in country property. And the thing that I think's significant is that over the 10 years or so that I've been teaching country living seminars during questions and answers, it's not uncommon for someone to say, but what about me? I can't afford to go and buy country property. Well, this particular first video clip is a couple who moved out of the city into the country, and they're sharing what they learned, but they've been renting. If you look carefully as they're explaining it, they've been renting and moving from time to time, probably because they're renting. So they've got some really good things to suggest, and we'll take a look at that clip now.
Thinking about moving to the country?
Maybe you don't know where to look or what to look for.
We decided 10 years ago that we were going to move out of the cities. And in this video, we're going to share with you 7 key elements to look for to help you in your search for your country property.
First thing you're going to want to look for is an independent water source. This can come in a variety of ways: a spring, a well, a creek, a pond, maybe even a lake.
The second thing we look for in a country property is if it has a stand of trees. This is important to us because a nice stand of trees can provide a number of different things. 1, a heat source, 2, privacy, and 3, even a possible means of income.
Third on our list is a place to grow your food. You're going to want to have a great garden spot and orchard.
This is a must-have. Just think, if you can grow your own food, the quality is going to be better, the taste, unbelievable. And you don't have to depend on the store for your food.
No.
Number 4 on the list is privacy. You might think, oh, you're out in the country, privacy is a given, but that's not always the case. Here's an example. We've lived on 3 acres where a house was set back from the road. We were surrounded by a buffer of hundreds of acres of cow pasture and trees versus a 100-acre property that we lived on, and the house was 50 feet from the road. Not so private.
I'm really excited about point 5, and that is a strategic location. We have this book, it's one of our favorite books written by Joel Skousen. It's called Strategic Relocation. And it's very important that you do find a strategic location when you are considering where you're going to be finding a country home. And he covers everything you can imagine in this book. Some of the considerations that you might have for a particular state are: what are the homeschooling laws like? Does that state respect constitutional rights? What are the natural disasters in that area? What's the climate in that area? How high is the crime? What's the population density? There are so many factors in this book that are considered. I highly recommend the book. but it is important that you do choose a strategic location.
Number 6 is the potential that the property has for alternative energy. If you're not familiar with what those are, most commonly wind energy, solar, and microhydro. So depending on the layout of the land, one could be better for you than another. So this is something that you're going to want to look into when you're observing a property.
The 7th thing that you're going to want to consider in finding your country property is the accessibility. Now, when you are considering accessibility, there's actually going to be different preferences for different people. Some people are going to want it to be as accessible as possible. Some people are going to want it to be very difficult to get into.
So some things that come to mind: springtime or the rainy season in most locations, mud could be horrible and make it very hard to get in and out of your property. Wintertime, if you live in an area north, snow might be an issue. Also, depending on where you live, flooding could be an issue in the winter or spring months.
Another thing that you want to consider when talking about accessibility is what access do people have to your property, and are you having to access through somebody else's property to get to your property?
Continuing what to look for in country property, this video clip is a couple that live in Hawaii, and they are owners of their property. And this is not their first country property effort actually in Hawaii. What they don't say is, and you can watch this family, they have a whole series of videos following their journey for the last 10 years or so. But they first got country property and were developing it. And remember, this is in Hawaii, and a volcano went off and actually completely blocked the whole area so nobody could get in or out ever. And so the property basically was worthless, and I assume they had to walk away from it. And now this video clip is the next time they started over again and what they've done to be in a better position.
In this discussion, we're going to be drawing from our own experience living off-grid in Hawaii for the past 10 years.
So one of the first things we considered is population density.
Population density is a measure of how many people live in a particular area. So it's measured in people per square mile. Typically, some parts of every state are very populated and other parts are not. So in the state of Hawaii, for example, in Oahu, the island of Oahu, there are over 1,600 people per square mile, and that is the population density. On this island, the island of Hawaii, the Big Island, this island has a population density that's currently 45 people per square mile. So another thing to consider is distance from the city. Here on this island, we're fortunate not to have any major cities. The nearest one would be several islands away, approximately 210 miles. However, on this island, we do have some small cities in the neighborhood of approximately 45,000 people. And so in the past, living on this island, we have lived as far as an hour away from the city or the small city. However, more recently, we were looking at a minimum of 10 miles outside of this town or city. And we ended up settling on a place approximately half an hour away. So we wanted enough distance for city expansion over time, as well as for us to be able to commute to work, get needed groceries and supplies during the development phase, etc.
Yeah.
I would say when considering a country property, that probably the home itself is probably one of the last things that one should consider. In other words, if you find a property and it looks like the property is actually not great, but the home is great, I would consider look elsewhere, because country living is a lot more than just country location. It is about independence, it's about reliance upon oneself and God, and there's a lot that goes into that. There's agriculture, there's generation of your own power, there's access to water, so there are many considerations. The first thing that we really looked at was property's suitability for agriculture.
Yes.
So thinking ahead, we know that that is perhaps paramount, right?
Privacy.
Yeah, so from the counsels that we've been given, as well as our own experience, as well as common sense, if you look around at the world today, privacy is very important, and it's becoming more and more important all the time. And so ideally you want to get a piece of property that will give you enough space, and if it doesn't have built-in privacy, you can always try to figure out some privacy that you can put in place.
Decent road access.
The access to your property, whether that be county roads or whether that be private roads, whatever it is, you've got to make sure that it's going to be suitable for your needs. Yeah. And everybody's needs may be a little different if people have access to different kinds of vehicles, etc. But you've just got to really consider. So the next thing we looked at was sunshine. And sunshine is really important for a lot of reasons. You want to purchase a place where cloud cover is not dominant, where you have access to sunshine for as much of the year as possible. And you need that for a couple of reasons. Number one, for independent power generation, which would mean solar power panels. And also
food production.
Also for food production. So you're going to have some agriculture, you're going to have trees, you're going to be growing gardens, and those are really going to rely upon the sun for food production. And so your food production and your power production could be significantly less if you happen to not have enough sun in your location.
Yes, and another important point is you want to consider your mental health, because without sunshine, most people feel very gloomy, and it's not a good environment to live in. So for us, it was very important, especially I'm a stay-at-home mom, and I stay at home most of the time with my kids. I wanted to be able to be most of the time in the sunshine and be happy most of the time, right?
Here in Hawaii, as you move away from the ocean, up the slopes of the mountains, typically the higher up you go, the less sunshine you have, the more cloud cover you have. And so for us, that meant the need to stay closer toward the ocean for the sunshine, for the lower elevation, which enables us to grow more crops, etc.
Yeah, it's really a fine balance to try to be not too close to the ocean, not too close to the highway, yet to be not too far away that you're just living in the clouds.
The next point is rainfall. Rainfall is key. It's absolutely key. You're relying upon this to pretty much grow whatever it is you need to grow, in addition to beautify and keep nature all green around you.
Let's see, the next thing is breezes, trade winds, and airflow.
So airflow is really important, and one of the ways that you can accomplish that, of course, is to make sure that the area around your home site is cleared enough that the breezes can come in, right? And in the absence of these winds or breezes, you're going to have mold problems, especially in high humidity areas like Hawaii.
Now let's talk about homeowner associations.
So our opinion on homeowners associations is to avoid them, really. So what they are is these are local groups, community groups, neighborhood associations that essentially want to be involved in all of your decisions that you make related to your property.
Let's see, phone and internet access, those are important things.
Yeah, so you probably want to consider when you're looking at your property, what kind of access do you have to phone and internet? You might have a cell signal, and that might be a blessing, as long as, of course, the cell tower is not right next door to you. But do you have access to what you need as far as phone and internet, whether that be landline or otherwise? Ideally, you want to live in an area where you're not the only person who's independent for the necessities of life. In other words, you don't want to be the only person who has large gardens and orchards. So if you can see that your neighbors are also have built some resiliency into their lives, they have some agriculture going on, etc., that's a real plus.
Because when the crisis comes, and you're the only one who has food, guess where everybody's going to go? Yeah,
and so we're always happy to share, but you don't want your own supplies to be wiped out by thieves.
Right, I mean, it's all about safety too.
We're also going to avoid land needing expensive improvements. At least you're going to want to really know about that and do your due diligence as to what it's going to cost before you sign on the dotted line.
Landlocked. What does that mean?
So you want to just make sure that you have legal access to the property. And so if your property is not bordering a county road or something like that, do you actually have legal access to get there?
Another thing is to avoid natural hazard zones.
Right, so the most common application of this would be flood zones. You're going to want to look at the FEMA flood site and look at their maps and see, is the area you're considering purchasing, is it at risk of flooding? So country living is really about many things, but one aspect of it is providing for the necessities of life, providing for our family. And so thinking ahead to a time when there will be no buying or selling for those who are faithful to God and keep His commandments.
Yes.
And so it's important that we realize what are some of the basic necessities of life. This is about water, food, shelter and warmth, and also personal safety. And so we want to make sure that when we're selecting a country property, that we can take care of these necessities of life on that property and that we have a plan on how to do that.
Now, another resource is the book on which this is a supplement, Sustainable Country Living. In the back of the book, on page 377, is a series of pages that are an addendum to the book called a property wish list. What happened is when the book was in manuscript form, I sent it to one of my friends in Arizona, and he read the book, and his critique was, and you can read his critique on the back of the book, but his suggestion was, why don't you add property wish list to the back of the book? So I did that, and this is it, and you can look at it in detail in the book. But here's an overview. Local and regional considerations. So what's the sustainability value? For instance, employment in the same career would be really important, or employment in another career would be really important. You need a career if you're not independently wealthy or retired. And so then we go down the list, and the page has multiple categories. There's property considerations of whether it's sustainable, such as south facing. We talked about that. That's important. Days without rain might be helpful, but it's not a deal killer. Proximity to power transmission lines, to me, is a negative. If you have high power tension lines crossing your property, you can't build underneath it, and it's probably not healthy to be there. So that's another example, and the list goes on. The view is nice, but it isn't important necessarily. And then the house itself, considerations for the house, comparing one that's already built and building one and so forth. So look in the back of the book for that list of properties. For more helpful videos to watch on the subject of what to look for in country property, go to preparingforthetimeoftrouble.com. Part 21 is what to look for in property, which is some of what you're learning in this presentation. Part 23 is how to find good country property. 25 is the pros and cons of developing bare property. Part 35 is country living on a budget, building a tiny house. Part 43 is living on a budget, money saving tips. Part 64 is preparing for wildfires. Part 294 is country living mistakes. 314 is a tour of a tiny house. 327 is finding country property. That's another person's presentation on that subject, how to find country property. 345, 363, 20 steps to moving to the country. So in conclusion, when you're considering a major move like moving out of the city into the country, like trying to find property to make your country homestead, remember, Christ can help you. Philippians 4:13 says, I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me. To be aware of new videos like this one, be sure to subscribe to the Preparing for the Time of Trouble channel. For more free videos and downloadable audio podcasts, as well as handouts, go to www preparingforthetimeoftrouble.com. Topic categories include recordings of live seminar presentations, country living, sustainable gardening, homestead remedies, how to be self-sufficient when the grid goes down, wild edible and medicinal plants, hydrotherapy, and end-time Bible prophecies. To take advantage of these free resources, go to preparingforthetimeoftrouble.com.